has to give us. And yeah, that's all I have to say. Shiva, welcome, and please take it away from here.
Awesome. Glad to be here, folks. Thanks a lot for the invite. I think there's a couple of slides around the product based introduction that we'll walk through, but I'm essentially going to be speaking about the user research topic and design thinking, and sort of we'll keep it interactive with most folks. And uh, it should be fairly informative. If it's not, definitely let me know, because I think one of the sort of like key things as a product manager that you will learn over time is the fact that you need to get constant feedback on whether the thing you're trying is actually working or not, especially with your audience and your target customer base. So I'm sort of going to use a lot of the techniques that I use at work over here as well. So what I'll do is there's a couple of like interactive sessions that I will probably just solicit like feedback. I don't know what the best method for that would be, whether it's just going to be over chat or whether folks can just speak up. Either way is fine. And I'm also instructing at the product school, so a lot of the content that I have is going to be sort of like mixed in with the things that we see at product school as well. So it's sort of like we'll give you a sort of like good introduction to the topic at hand. So keeping that in mind, let me start sharing my screen, and then we can take it from there. And let me know when you can see my screen. Awesome. So I think it's sharing right now. If not, let me know. But I don't know who wants to speak to the product-based slides, but go for it.
Should I go ahead? Okay.
Yes.
So yeah, I just want to talk to everyone about who we are. We are the product base, and what we essentially do is help students from UTD and students from outside be familiar with what it is to be a product manager, and just the main idea is for you to be able to contribute very well to your organization once you're a product manager there. And how do we go about doing this? We go about doing this by connecting with different people, different product managers from different organizations who have different perspectives on what it is to be a product manager. And this is essentially who we are and what we do. So we welcome you to this event, and we hope this helps you become a better product manager. Yeah, Shiva, you can go ahead now.
Cool, awesome. So in this session, I think we're going to mainly focus on the customer discovery, design thinking, and the user research sort of topics. Obviously, it'll be interactive. I'll touch on the target audience feature research piece of it, but I think the main content is going to be the top three on this. And after that, we'll probably, since it is going to be interactive, we'll probably give you like a first-hand experience on how folks go about these topics. But I'm not too sure there's a case, but we'll see when we get to that point. So that's essentially what we're going to cover in this session. And I know there's like further sort of topics coming up after this as well. A little about me. So yeah, as was mentioned, like I am currently at Uber, senior product manager here. Been with the company for a couple of years. Worked a lot on the sort of like the communications product stack. So any email, push notifications, in-app sort of like messages, including like the advertising ecosystem. So if you've seen ads on Facebook or Google for Uber Eats, those are all essentially using some part of the product stack that I work on and I manage. And to me, like what is interesting about doing this at Uber is the fact that we are doing this at really serious scale. So we are working across all lines of businesses. So you basically have the Uber Rides business, Uber Eats business. You have like our Uber Freight. We have groceries coming up from the corner shop. We also have U4B and Uber Health. So there's like a whole host of like lines of businesses that use the product. There's also regions. So there's, as most of you know, like Uber operates across the world. So we are essentially operating campaigns that run in like EMEA, APAC, LATAM, the US, Canada. All of those are essentially being managed by my product stack. So it's fairly large. Scope is fairly large. So with the scope comes like the level of complexity of how do you sort of manage customer requests across the board, understanding like who the customer is, what their specific needs are, and sort of taking that into consideration. I come to Uber like after almost like 8-9 years in the space. So I was with Yahoo and Disney Gaming, and then I also worked for some startups that got acquired. So seen both large and small companies, sort of like focused on building products in both, understand like the digital marketing ecosystem in fairly a lot of detail. And in all honesty, like if there's one thing that I would sort of like take away from this whole experience, it's the fact that if you build products that meet a customer need or solve a user's pain point, it actually goes a long way to sort of build the momentum towards adding more features and making sure that the product is sticky enough. And there's a lot of like ways to get to that. But the whole point of this is keeping your customer front and center and making sure that you're building something that actually solves a problem. So one of the things that you see as part of like a product death spiral, if you can call it that, is folks think that just adding features to products is what a product manager does. It's one part of the job for sure, but it's not everything. And I think that's something to sort of keep in mind, that it's fine to kill a feature, deprecate a product as a product manager. It doesn't mean that you just keep adding. There's also times when you need to move away from things if it's not working and your users moved on. And I think that's essentially been the really like cool part about working with software products, is the fact that you get almost immediate feedback from your customers, either through signals that you can capture from your product, or you can actually get anecdotal feedback from them. Because you're getting all of this feedback, it is important to pay close attention to what actually matters and what's not, and also make that as part of your whole design thinking and customer development processes in order to move forward. And obviously the industry has come a long way in the last like 10-15 years, and these are sort of like status quo sort of like considerations for building products these days. So anything that I'm talking about right now, it's very little like new concepts here. These are all fairly commonplace across the industry, which also makes it sort of like difficult to just ignore, because every company, every product manager is going through some process of customer development, design thinking, UX design. And if you don't master these techniques, then in theory you're sort of left behind, and you definitely don't want to be in that bucket. So before we sort of like get into the weeds of what UX design and customer development looks like, if I had to take like a one stab at understanding what like user experience is, you would call it like the design of dialogue between humans and information systems. And in the spirit of like keeping it like interactive this session, just wanted to get like some like thoughts from everyone listening. What do you think user experience actually is? Which part of the product would you consider to be like really like key for a UX person to pay attention to, a product person to pay attention to? What do you think the whole UX space is all about?
So I can try answering this. In today's world, with the amount of competition for any given product, user experience could be the defining factor if the customer chooses your product or your competitor. For example, in websites, right? Like I have a background in software development. Nowadays, languages like Angular that run mostly on component-based loading are taking precedence in terms of user experience as compared to just vanilla JavaScript, which causes the entire page to reload, disrupting the user experience. Whereas languages such as Angular or React focus on component-based loading, which enhances the user experience. So, a website's code may contribute to the user experience, and finally, contribute if to decide if the customer stays with you or shifts to another brand's website or so on.
No, that's, I mean, you make a great point. Like the technical considerations around load times, performance, those are all extremely key for making sure user experience is key. But to be really, really like honest, if, and we'll see this in like a couple of slides later, the user experience doesn't start and stop with someone touching your site. It is essentially like everything that leads them to the site and everything that might even lead them off the site as well. So if you think about like an Apple store, buying an Apple product, the Apple buying an Apple product doesn't isn't just getting the phone or getting the laptop, right? It's essentially the experience you see in the Apple store. Like who are you interacting with there? Like what is going on behind the scenes in the warehouse where they're actually having inventory of different sort of like product lines. The same thing in today's world. If you think about buying a car on test for Tesla, right? Uh, there is no dealership, right? You're essentially going to the website and ordering a car, and suddenly the car just shows up outside your house. Like, but the experience is so minimalistic in all of these regards that you may think that it's just sitting in the car or using the phone that defines the product. No, it's everything that you're sort of like interacting with the company, which includes the information systems, but it's beyond just the technology part of the entire product itself. And that's the thing to sort of keep in mind when you think about user experience, because it's okay to zoom out a bit. It's okay not to talk about or consider it in terms of the programming language or the modules needed or the feature sets or the functionality. It's okay to zoom out because all you're sort of like trying to see is if I have a need to, let's say, buy a phone, if I have a need to make a call, if I have a need to sort of like open a bank account, if I have a need to sort of like exchange like payments across users. If you think the need is very abstract and it's technology agnostic, so any product can fill that gap, but you choose one product over the other, right? And essentially the reason is because it goes beyond just the software product itself. So right now, let me jump a little outside the box on talking about the basics of like how you would define sort of like user experience, right? So let's take this. There's an example here, which is Introduction to Design Thinking at Stanford. So the ask here is if I had to, and this is again for the whole group here, if I come in as a consultant for you personally, right, and I say, hey, I want to sort of like design your morning routine in order to optimize towards specific goals. And the goals could be you want to like reach your class or your work on time every single day, right? I don't want to ever be late. I don't want the weather to play a role. I don't want like the fact that I was partying all night that I couldn't wake up on time. So there could be a whole host of considerations, but the goal is I want to reach class or work on time. If that's the goal, so the first step in all of this is just to zoom out and say, just chart your morning routine, right? Like what exactly goes on um, from the time your alarm rings to the time you sort of like rush to the door to the class or your work. There's a whole host of activity that goes on from this point to this point. Some where you feel like super terrific. There are some where you feel super terrible. For me, like obviously, like waking up is going to fall in this bucket. But for some folks, like the fact that after you have your morning coffee, you feel terrific. Like so, just being able to like chart out every single step of yours before you sort of like reach out is the first place to start with any experience that you want to sort of mimic as part of your product, right? Um, so I would say that's like step one, and I'll share this document after so you can actually go through these things. But the second piece to sort of look into is, okay, just take a if you really had a goal, right? And the goal we decided was we wanted to like always be on time for work. You sort of like spend time talking to your counterpart to understand better uh, like why do they do the things they do, right? Like what is, it's not even just about just asking them what you do, but why is it that you never wake up when the alarm rings? Why is it that you always first need to get a cup of coffee before you sort of like you feel terrific? So you're essentially going down the path of like asking these questions of the users, and then you're sort of like trying to understand what do you need to accomplish and what sort of insights do you feel from the user's standpoint, and then come up with your own recommendation of like uh, this person needs a way to improve their morning routine to reach work on time, because for whatever reason they're always like 10 minutes late after like the alarm rings or something, right? So you can basically write your point of view on this and then ideate on the 5 ways you may improve this routine. Like maybe set your alarm for like 10 minutes earlier, right? Like those sort of like come up with those 5 specific things that you could do in this, and then sort of like go through the process to generate this new solution, and you build and test to see whether you actually did achieve the goal or not, right? And you are essentially capturing the feedback and questions or ideas and what could be improved on this process. So to be honest, this is something that like UX folks, product folks go through almost on a weekly, monthly, quarterly basis, because essentially you're rolling out features, you're essentially trying to capture like why do you need something, right? And as a PM, I think it's extremely critical for you to wear that why hat all of the time, right? Like if someone came and told you that, hey, I need to build XYZ, or if the customer says, I need like a new way to sort of like um, uh, chart out a route to my class or my work. The question is like you as a PM should ask, okay, why is this necessary, right? Because you already have all these existing tools. What in these existing tools is not satisfying your essential outcome, right? So it is important to wear the why hat. And I'll share that morning routine worksheet because I think it's sort of foundational to how you want to think. And it also allows us the opportunity to zoom out a bit, right? We don't want to be in the weeds of thinking about features and rollouts and what is the tech that goes to build it. No, just get out of that entire space and just think about your user and figure out like what is it that they would need, and spend time doing that. It's perfectly well spent, like the time. So it's not I wouldn't call it like an onerous spend. So in anything, like I think what we will go through in the next few slides is essentially understanding what this user experience role is, what's the expected outcomes from this step, and also like why design-based thinking is necessary and why should it be used. We'll go through these, and then we'll also get into the world of like defining your customers. Essentially talk about a little bit of persona development, the customer journey maps, and then essentially wrap up with usability testing to sort of like understand how exactly are you going to understand whether an idea or a feature or a solution that you have is actually meeting its intended outcome or not. Because at the end of the day, like it is very important to measure whether anything that you're suggesting from a solution standpoint is actually working or not. Because if it's not incrementally improving any success criteria or goals, then in theory you should not be building or spending time or resources on those sort of like tasks. It has to improve the overall outcome. So I'm going to jump into this side. I'm sure a lot of you use Medium, so you're well aware of like what is the site all about. But I want to give like maybe the next 15-20 seconds to just talk about what do you think what do you think the role of a UX person or a UX designer in this space, in this site, actually has helped improve from a desired outcome perspective. There's like obviously a whole host of things here. There's obviously the 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 navigation bar on the top. You have like specific notifications for yourselves. You have all of these different like articles. And then you also have an ad here, if I'm mistaken. But you see all of these. So what are the few things that stands out for you when you look at a Medium site?
I would say a few things that are based on your search history or based on your use of the website. It will prompt you with similar topics that you might be interested in. So that captures your attention and you keep coming back and read more articles on similar things. So that
Exactly.
is
So
one of
they're
the,
essentially personalizing this thing. Okay.
yeah, yeah.
Mhm. That's good. That's a good observation.
The bookmarks feature is good as well, so that I can quickly go to articles that I've previously bookmarked,
Mhm.
and I don't need to search for them.
Yeah, that's a again, it sort of helps with recall, right? You can get to the articles as quickly as possible. That's a different one. If I had to take one thing that I really like about Medium is this how long of a read it is, right? The fact that they add like these 4 minutes, 9 minutes, 7 minutes, 5 minutes. I think to me that's huge because it's like it's one of those barriers that I have before I click on something because I don't know how long this is going to take. And to be honest, it may not even be like 9 minutes. It depends how fast a reader you are. But on average, they're essentially giving you those indications that this is either a 9 minute read or not. I find that extremely valuable. Um, what other things over here do you think is interesting?
For some of the articles, they have audio recording.
Yeah, the multimedia support on this is interesting, for sure. And obviously, like the whether it's starred or not, you can actually like see like what sort of like rating an article has. I also know for a fact that the this header bar is personalized as well. It depends on topics that you have liked, or you basically walk into. These are not the same for everyone. So you see there's a whole host of things that you see here that slowly starts coming up, right? Which makes this site different from, let's say, any other, like, I know for the fact that CNN doesn't have like a lot of these features. To me, like the date here also matters, right? How relevant and recent these articles are. Those are also important. So you can start to see like a place where like UX starts playing a role. Now let's take an example of a travel app. Essentially, you're trying to buy tickets to a specific place. Now, if I had to ask you like how exactly would you buy a ticket from Paris to London using like this UX, how would you do that?
We'd basically go to the app, start with searching up the destination, and then set our preferences if it's a one-way trip or a round trip, and then select the dates, and then eventually select the preferable flight, and then so on. So I think the good thing here
Exactly.
is, yeah,
And then I think one of the things that I feel is not intuitive over here is the fact that they don't give you the price of the tickets. They give you like the option around frequency, duration, holiday frequency, but it would be good if they also obviously stack rank this by price and also knowing what mode of transport you're going to take. But I mean, the thing is, since we're all using products on a daily basis, we are fairly like I think thrown into like any new product, most of us can figure our way out. Uh, I would be actually surprised if there were products that confuse us because we are obviously like grown up using a lot of these software products. So I don't think we're going to get that confused. But there's always one product every now and then that would probably throw you off a bit because they've started using like new elements on the page that you were not like sort of familiar with before, right? So let's take this example. This is like the Microsoft Outlook inbox, sort of like the um, probably like one of the earliest sort of enterprise softwares that came live. Now, if someone were to come and ask you if there is sufficient UX input in this product, what would your take be in this scenario?
The first thing that throws me off is too much information is being presented on the single screen. So even if they have put in any UX efforts in this, that's clearly not enough. They're trying to present everything that a user might need, but that's just too much.
Perfect. Yeah. That's it's the thing that you sort of take away from this is that, I mean, there's not always is UX engineering and product working in sync. And I'm not going to say that it's not sort of like done here. They've taken pains to add a lot of UX, except the fact that products can get complex very quickly. And obviously like Microsoft Outlook and has been around for like easily like 20, 25 years now. So if the product's been around for this long, there's going to be so many features that users want. There's also a set of features that historically users have always used. And then there's obviously like things that like Outlook wants to innovate and bring into the mix, right? Now, if you start getting all three feedback, what do you like? It ends up becoming this complex product where there's just features thrown at you left, right, and center, right? There's just so much going on the screen that it is very difficult to pick like the real clear sort of like goal we are trying to measure for a user. And that's also probably because there's just so many like different personas that this product is actually solving problems for. The question is there something you can do on this product to make it smarter, right? Or to actually like make it more relevant to your specific user, whoever the user actually is. So you can see like the generational shift in UX choices that come across, and the more complex the product starts getting, the more difficult is it for a UX designer to actually play like a role that doesn't that we need to like then prioritize like the personas or the customers that we are essentially solving this UX problem for. And so there needs to be a lot more thinking that needs to go into this. So just a few examples here. Now I'm going to give you this one last example, and I'm going to ask, just if you look at the sort of like the middle screen here, let me know what your immediate thoughts are when you see like all of these different buttons for this app.
And there's too much of
Oh.
color on the screen.
The content is very, very cluttered for the first two at least. The one to the complete right, it's a little more spaced out.
True. And to me, like the piece that sort of stands out is there's like 4 different share buttons, right? Like they're all doing exactly the same action. Obviously, you're sharing to a different destination, but there are 4 buttons for shares and 1 button for a conversion. And the colors, obviously, there's no relation between the colors on the first screen and the second. So there's a lot to be said here. It can obviously make it can be simplified and it can be more meaningful. But you get the point of like what a bad UX design starts looking like, right? It's essentially like there doesn't seem to be a clear action that you want the user to take. And it seems like the goal of this product is split across all of these share actions and there's one convert action, which doesn't mean that you're leading the user to any one particular goal, right? It could just be all over the place. So it also means like if I were a PM for a product like this, I actually do not know what my success criteria or goal to measure here would look like. Essentially because I'm confusing the user to begin with, right? And obviously like products like these don't go out live. There's obviously a lot of testing that goes on, but once in a while you'll see a bad design sort of like make its way out there. And then essentially you're looking at how do you improve it. There's obviously a classical designs like the YouTubes of the world where they've started adding more and more information, but it is still, it could go in the direction of the Microsoft Outlook. But the key here is they have hidden a lot of complexity as well, right? So I think it's just generally important to keep in mind that the more complex a product starts getting, the more difficult it is to sort of keep a clear thought. So in any case, I want to like bring in like Dong Norman, who is essentially the sort of like the one who coined the term user experience. And essentially he makes a good point here, right? Like as we sort of discussed earlier, like if you just start looking at like every screen and every product and the technology component of it, then you're essentially just limiting yourself. You're making the design and the usability like very narrow. And he essentially wanted to take it much broader. Like it's everything that you sort of interact with the sort of like company and which includes like the industrial design, graphics, interface, physical interface, even the manual, right? Like I'll give you an example. Like I was actually like buying this a product from this was essentially when the hoverboards were sort of like the age. I wanted to get like a very early version from China, which came with its own sort of like manual that was sort of, it seemed like it was translated from Chinese to English, but the manual made no sense at all, right? Like there was nothing in the manual that was actually of value. Then you start getting into this world where you have this product, you kind of know how to use it, but if something were to go wrong, you had nowhere to look, which sort of again broke the experience of how you would interact with this product, right? So there's enough thought, if there's enough thought put into all of these and it's streamlined, then you're essentially on the right path. Even if like one of these things are broken, you sort of end up in a bad place. So that's the one sort of key thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about like user experience. So if I had to take a stab at like what exactly like user experience design looks like, it's the process of creating like meaningful and like relevant experiences to users and customers. And this could be in the process of creating products, creating like the entire like interaction with product stores and the company itself. But it is important to keep these three things in mind, right? You're starting from your customers, you're making it relevant, and you're making it meaningful. And there are ways to get around like or frameworks to apply here to sort of like figure out how you would want to do this. So like an example here is a big question that comes is like, where do I get started, right? Like how do I begin? And the piece to sort of keep in mind here is the fact that you keep your user at the center, you start researching their needs, you're starting identifying their needs, and then you want to start bringing in the concepts of branding, design, usability, and functionality into the mix. And that integration with the user's needs is essentially the sort of like loop that you want to start creating whenever you start thinking about building products. To me, like that, the sort of like the thing to sort of take away there is that it's at a very abstract level, right? It's not, no one's talking about the actual code. You're not anywhere near code at this point. You're still at the needs level, which also means when people ask what UX is not, it's none of these things, right? Like if people ask, okay, what is the web design or the graphic design or development or UI design, whether it's branding, usability, it's not these things. It is about understanding your users, creating a framework to capture their needs, and understanding like how do they sort of like interact to achieve their goals. How do they interact with any sort of like surface or interface to reach their goal, and sort of like how do you streamline that process, right? That's where you want to live when you start thinking about UX. Now, obviously, a lot of the manifestation of a UX eventually ends up being on one of these things. So you do have a UI, you do have like the web development underneath, but it doesn't start the other way around, right? So you're not starting with web development and thinking about UX. You start with UX, then you eventually get into one of these buckets, obviously, because you have to develop. You need project management at the part, you need branding at that part, but it's never the other way around. So that's one thing to sort of keep in mind whenever you're thinking about UX. Now, one thing that sort of comes in mind is like, what is the role, right? What is the role of a PM in any of these versus a UX designer? And there's a big difference between what a PM is responsible for and what a UX designer is responsible for. A PM's goal is essentially trying to make the overall product successful, right? So it's not the one interaction to achieve a goal. It's everything that is associated with the product, which also means like you are being able to deliver like features on time. You're able to like test and measure a feature in market. You're essentially talking to your customers and getting their feedback about what is actually working and what's not. You're collecting like qualitative tests, trying to see like whether they can even achieve their goal when you give them a product feature. You're also obviously responsible for the go-to-market strategy of your product. You're also responsible for creating the collateral of what actually makes your product different from anyone else, the competitive analysis, the market strategy. So there's a whole bunch of things that go on with the PM's role, who's responsible for the overall success of the product. UX designer, on the other hand, they're sort of like zoomed in, right? They're essentially just looking at user needs and essentially trying to make sure that the needs and the business goals are met with the sort of outputs that they can come up with respect to user experiences. So they're essentially like zoomed in to just the users and building the sort of like the whole framework around them. The PM's obviously plugged into this interaction as well, but the PM's role is a little more than just the UX piece of this entire sort of like discussion. So if anyone asks like how do you divide roles between like PM and like user UX roles, right? Which is a PM is definitely like sort of like plugged in to all of these, but there's primary and secondary owners in a lot of these scenarios, right? So when you think about like who owns the product, obviously the product manager owns it, but user experience folks are secondary owners in this sense, right? Because they're responsible for delivering the user experiences. Whether you understand the domain and the user, obviously the product manager is responsible for defining like the target market, the segments needed. The user experience folks, the design folks are responsible for creating the personas. So they're essentially like focusing on the specific users versus the market or the segment. So there's like a slight difference between the two. Segments are more aggregated in nature. Personas are more individualistic. So you're essentially looking at individuals in that scenario. There's also like a question of like high level requirements of like, why are we trying to solve this, right? Like, and what are we trying to achieve? Those are all part of the business requirements, product requirements that the product manager sort of puts into place. The user experience folks are part of this because at the end of the day, the experiences that they come up with are the ones that are actually going to be solving the problem. We looked at a few examples of like what those requirements would look like. And then comes like the whole point of like user stories, right? Who's actually writing those individual user stories for developers and the UI person to actually start building. Either one can take leadership on this. On sitemaps, wireframes, prototypes, the UX person is the primary role. Usability, again, the UX person's role is the primary role because they're the ones who are coming up with these concepts that they need to test in multiple places, whether it's in market or whether it's in a focus group or a user group. You're essentially trying to do that in a limited scale before making a choice of one versus the other. So to me, like this split is interesting to keep in mind. But then if you sort of like look into what do the requirements entail, right? Like what exactly do you mean by requirements? So when as a PM, I can basically say, I need a place for the user to enter their profile, right, in the product. Like profile creation is an important part of the user experience. But what does the form look like, right? Like what exactly are the fields in the forms that I need to sort of like enter? Those are things that the product design or the UX design person may be responsible for. Obviously, you can say that I want these fields to be captured, but in what order do they come? Whether you use like any third-party authentication systems to sort of bring this in, those may be somewhat a design element or a designer's choice of bringing those in. Also, like how many steps does it take to get to, right? Is it like a one-page profile creation step or is it a three-page profile creation step? Now, obviously, like if the designer says it's three pages long and the PM says it's 1 page long, there's obviously no right answer to this. You have to test this to know which one actually performs better than the other. But in a lot of scenarios, I've seen PMs like subscribe to the designer's point of view because you know that the designer's not obviously pulling these form designs from thin air. They're actually talking to folks. They're running like the research to actually get to those designs. So the PM usually says, that's fine, let's go on with it, right? So there's like a lot of these sort of like choices that the PM comes in with a point of view, the designer comes in with a point of view, and it needs to be sort of like reconciled, tested to see like which one actually works versus not. So that's something to sort of keep in mind whenever you think about the division of roles between product and user experience. Now, obviously, the larger sort of like $1 million question is like what is the difference between UX and UI, right? And a lot of times, the way you should think about this is like UI is a small part of what a UX designer does, if at all. The UI person and the UX person may not be the same, but essentially the UI person is implementing the designs coming up with that the UX folks have actually come up with. So you can think about UI to be like a subset of UX. So whenever in market, when you're looking at UX UI people, I want a UX UI person, they're more likely asking for a UI person. They're really not asking for a UX person, because if obviously they're thinking through this long term, UX does a lot more than just building the UIs, right? So I think that's something to keep in mind whenever you're sort of like thinking about this. The other sort of question that comes up is, what's the difference between like customer experience and user experience design? And the big difference here is that the customer experience is for users who have already used your product. So they're essentially like returning users or re-engaging users. So essentially it's folks who are already existing customers, whereas UX sort of encompasses everything, like potential and existing customers. So you can think about, again, customer experience is a subset of UX, but UX is thinking about your customers completely, whether they're new users or returning users. So that's one thing to sort of keep in mind. The other question is around user researchers versus UX designers. And the thing about here, again, user researchers are part of UX teams or designer teams. But it's again a small part of the work that the UX person does. They do a lot more than just doing user research. So that's something to keep in mind. But again, one other thing to sort of keep in mind here is that it's different in larger companies and smaller companies. Smaller companies may combine these roles to one person, but larger companies, you do have like a split in these teams to sort of like take into consideration. So I'll pause there. Just wanted to check in to see if there are any sort of like questions, thoughts, before I jump into like the design thinking part of the discussion.
Yes, I have a question. So I've actually noticed sometimes while talking to users to in order to understand what the requirements are. Usually they tell us what they need. How do we take that information and come up with actually what do they want? For example, as you spoke about the forms, they would usually say, okay, I want just a one-page form. That's just a few fields, but sometimes as a product manager, I know it is not that easy to capture the data in one single form, right? And if it's too lengthy, they may drop off, and that could be a cause that we're losing customers. So how do we make that? How do we understand that?
Yeah, so I mean that's a fairly like that's a good point and sort of fairly commonly seen. My take here is two things, right? Like um, there's obviously this whole Henry Ford sort of example of your customer obviously doesn't know everything that they want. They will probably ask for a faster horse and instead of a car, sort of a thing, right? Like that's the role of a PM there is key, because you're listening very carefully and you can basically give them something better than the customer has actually envisioned on their side, right? So that's a lens that a PM always wears. It's a critical lens, because you really want to cut through the noise and get to the outcome they're looking for. So, which is why you're sort of like really need to be obsessed with the customer outcomes. Like, don't tell me how to do it. Tell me like what you need and why you need it, right? Like, and obsessing over that, right? Like, because the why question also is probably like you need the 5 whys, right, before you even get the answer. It's not, no one tells you the why on the first go. There's like a why behind a why behind a why behind a why. So it, I feel it is important to pay close attention to those why and the what's. The how is something you can work in conjunction with your UX person to define. To me, like that's one thing. But the second piece, as you mentioned, like how do you even figure out like what and how, why, like when the customer is not clear about it, that's where the customer journey maps come into play. And we'll look at a few examples, because the customer journey maps, what they're essentially doing is they're breaking out the different steps that the customer takes in order to achieve the outcome, whatever the outcome they're looking for. But they're also talking about what do they do right now in order to achieve that, and how do they feel when they do each of these steps, right? Do they feel confused? Do they feel happy? Do they feel like this is not taking them in the right direction? All of those feedback is an input on knowing where there can be improvements and what you can actually look for, right? In your scenario, like if it takes like, if a one-page form is not going to solve it, like the question is like, first of all, why do you need like so many fields? And what are you trying to do with so much data, right? Like, I mean, obviously the larger question is I want data because you can do a whole bunch of use cases in the future with all that data. But it needs to tie to something like a very tangible outcome of like collecting data, which you see in a lot of apps these days, which is they don't ask you for a lot more data than what they're actually trying to do and solve the problem for. And maybe over time you can collect that, but on the first go, you want to minimize the friction and the barriers that you want to edit for your user, right? So you're essentially just collecting as minimum number of points that you can, making it easier for them. But that is an outcome of someone sitting with the customer and drawing the journey, right? About like in similar products, what frustrates them the most, right? Is it the fact that all these other companies ask me to fill out like 50 pages of 50 fields before I actually even get the value? To me, that is a competitive signal that immediately you should take advantage of, where you make it easier for people to sign up, which actually makes them a more stickier sort of user for you, right? So those are the things it is important to keep in mind. And we'll look at a bunch of customer journey maps, because I think that will be key to sort of like answering the question. So sort of moving on, the second piece is around design thinking. And again, it's sort of like it's second level to the things that we were just talking about, which is the goal here is to keep your customers at the center of every problem, right? And a big part of your customer human-centered or customer-centered approach in all of this is it is about building empathy for your customers. And it is sort of like a term that folks don't want to get too close to, because they think it is too touchy-feely and I don't know what to do with empathy and stuff. But the basic theory for most PMs is like, unless you empathize with your customers about the problems they face in achieving the outcomes, you're never going to be able to solve their problems meaningfully, because you will probably end up in a never-ending loop of just throwing more features at the problem without truly understanding what is actually causing their pain, right? And in order for you to understand their pain, you have to be able to empathize with them. And I think that is a key sort of like step that I would never try to minimize. And it doesn't have to be, you don't have to be like the Facebooks of the world to create empathy. Like any product you work on, even if it's an internal product, if it's a tool set you're building for your internal teams, any product that you sort of lay your hands on, even like the products you use as a customer, right? Like I would generally take a step back and think like, how do you feel about using a certain product, right? And obviously the ones you use a lot, the reason you use it is because it solves a problem as quickly as possible without asking too many questions. In some sense, someone has been in your shoes, knows what you want, and is able to solve for those. That's a level of empathy that you're trying to get to, which means that these sort of like 5 steps is important, right? First step, empathize. Second step is once you empathize and you put yourself in the shoes of someone, you need to ask those questions, right? And the five whys are like a great place to start. Like, why do you want to do a certain action? How does it make you feel? Like what are the actions that you take right now versus what would you like to take in the future? Being able to ask those key questions to define like the set of actions that need to solve a problem. Then comes the ideation and the brainstorming step, right? Because you may have like these questions and what the customer wants, but maybe you have a totally innovative way to solve the problem, right? That just totally like bypasses all of their current frustrations. You're essentially just like taking like you're leapfrogging their current scenario to a completely new world, right? And you see that constantly in a lot of products that we use. Like if you think about the whole jump from the touch ID to the face ID on an Apple device, right? Like, and how deeply the face ID is integrated with any app that requires security. You're essentially leapfrogging from a world where people wanted a better password management system to the fact that you want to provide security to a point where you're using a face ID sort of a feature, right? Like if you asked your customers, all they would say is, I want a better tool to remember my passwords. Like that would be their ask. But if you wanted to really emphasize, you're essentially saying that, hey, I don't want to be bothered by these things, but I also want security, right? Like that's the actual need in this scenario. And you're essentially coming up with these solutions to solve for those. Now, to me, like that's key, because any sort of like problem space or app that we use today, it's pretty clear that there's ways to leapfrog your current design and solutions to a very different world. Obviously, the execution needs to match that, but there is no sort of solution that you want to just have an incremental approach of like just making a small change and thinking that that is actually solving someone's problem. It may in the short run, but there are ways to sort of get around it. Now, obviously, empathize, define, ideate are great places, but obviously you need to you need to build it and you need to be able to take it to market, right? And the prototype building is an important step because it's sort of the world where you live in the MVP, right? Which is you want a minimum viable product that you know stands on its own feet, that you can actually build representations on for these ideas that actually solve the problem. But again, you don't want to commit like too many resources on solving this. You don't have the investment and the funding to sort of like infinitely like spend on a particular product. So if you're in that world, then you have to be able to like really like pare down your ask to come up with prototypes or MVPs to actually solve the problem. And I feel this is again a very key place for a product manager to put their lens in, because more often than not, like any of your leaders, when you become product managers, the one thing that they will really like ask you to sort of qualify and quantify is, why do you need so many engineers to build a certain feature, right? And it has to make sense. Like it has to be such a small incremental step that you're taking that solves the problem with the minimum required resources at the minimum cost, and you're able to quantify the impact and the value, and that is when you have a win. Like it is not enough to build a feature, it is not enough to throw people at the problem, it is not important to come up with the right idea. All of these things are great things, but if you cannot deliver on building your MVP and testing it and gaining user feedback, then you've really not succeeded in this entire process. And PMs really need to come in the last two steps with a very aggressive like lens, because the first four you can get a lot of UX people to UX designers to help you with, but the last two steps are extremely product driven, and it needs to be like there's always going to be pushback, because if you ask for 3 engineers, you may get 1. And if you get 1 engineer, what exactly are you going to do with that 1 engineer is always going to be the question. The engineer obviously is just going to build what you ask them to build. They're really not going to question it too much, which means the responsibility of defining what that prototype looks like all falls on your shoulder, right? So that's something to keep in mind, because resources are always like limited in most companies. So it's something to take back. So sort of flipping this whole thing, right? Like what does it look like from discovery stage to like a refining stage? So we've seen like the discovery piece is sort of like a joint goal between like product and design. Definition is also sort of joint goal. Design, obviously design leads that. The develop, deploy, and refine is a place where product folks really step in and they take ownership on a lot of these things. But it is important to sort of keep these 3 things in mind, discover, define, and design, because at the end of the day, like you want to follow frameworks, repeatable frameworks that you can use across products and across companies, right? You don't want to keep reinventing the wheel over all of these things, especially because there may be other folks who already know all of these. So you also want to just go in with the same language that you're speaking with them, and you don't want to like introduce like completely brand new concepts that are trying to explain the exact same thing that you're trying to do with them, right? So that's something to keep in mind. So then I think this is going to be an important, and I also want to do a time check. It's 6 o'clock. So do we have like 30 more minutes? Okay.
Yes, we will.
Okay, cool. So let me try to keep the pace on this one. So the whole point of like design research is you're coming up with personas, right? And the thing about personas to keep in mind is it's very different from your target segment, right? Whenever people think about who are you building a product for, if you say, hey, I'm building it for millennials who live in urban areas, who like social networking, that's a target segment, right? But within the millennials who live in urban areas who like social networking, there's going to be real people where you may have like a 30-year-old person living in San Francisco who likes Facebook versus a 25-year-old who lives in New York City and likes Snapchat. Their needs are going to be very different. And it is important to sort of zoom in to sort of like look at personas and base it on real people. And the reason you need to do it is those 4 things in the bottom, right? Because you want to know how they behave. You want to know what are they thinking and why are they thinking what they're thinking, and what do they want to accomplish, what's the goal, and why do they want to do it, right? And you want to be able to be as clear, crystal clear with your personas, because your personas will directly lead you to the design choices you make in your product, will directly lead you to the features that you have in your product. So you don't want to like minimize the personas. The thing about personas though is you may have a lot of personas. You may have more than one persona for sure, but you will have a lot of personas. And the world where you have a lot more personas, the question then comes into prioritization, right? Like which persona do you want to pick to solve for first, as opposed to sort of like moving into a world where you're sort of like solving for a segment and you're really not solving any one persona's problem, right? That place you don't want to be. You really want to be in a place where you're actually at least solving it for one persona completely. And an example is for Airbnb, right? Like obviously Airbnb has hosts, and I can say my hosts are anyone who has uh, like an extra room to spare or an extra house to spare, and they want to like earn like supplemental income, right? Cool, that's a target segment. All of my hosts are more likely to fit there. But when you zoom in, you realize that there's a persona Sam and there's a persona Mark and Mary. And the persona Sam is obviously has a room, and they're essentially using Airbnb for sort of like just their additional cash, right? They're not dependent on the cash. They're essentially they're either paying one part of their rent with the income, or but essentially they're not this is not their retirement income or something. They still have a job. They're still going out, working and stuff. So there's a different world for Sam than the needs of Mark and Mary who have retired. This is their income, right? This is their supplement income. So it is extremely more critical for them to have like long-term renters as opposed to like short-term renters. And they need additional tools for forecast management. They need additional tools for property management, for cleaners. So their needs are very different from the needs of Sam. And if I was a PM on Airbnb, I need to do both of these things. I have to be able to solve for the Sams of the world. I also need to be able to solve for the Mark and the Marys of the world. And the thing about prioritization is then comes to numbers, right? From your market analysis, which of these like personas actually is the one that is most likely to adopt your product first, is actually going to contribute to your revenue first, is what is going to drive the choices for these personas. Now, obviously, there's going to be things that are common between the two, and you would want to take that into consideration, but you also want to be cognizant and you want to empathize with the fact that your forecast management system or your property management system on Airbnb may not be coming for the next 6 months, right? So you want to be able to inform the Mark and Marys of the world that there may be other tools like the pillow tool that you see here that may help them solve the problem. That's not going to be on the Airbnb platform. So those are sort of things to sort of keep in mind. A question that keeps coming up all the time is around like demographics. Like, do you mean personas are demographics? And no, if demographics lend to your personas, but it's not the sole thing, right? Like there may be like the needs and the lifestyle choices that may highly correlate with demographics, but it may not explain the person completely. So it is important to go beyond demographics to define your personas. And the one thing to keep in mind here is that the starting on how what your persona looks like is going to influence how you do your research as well. So if it's like the Mark and Marys of the world, maybe like you have to either call them, you may have to pay them a visit. You're essentially trying to get information from them. Whereas the Sams of the world, if they live in your same city, you can actually call them into the office and have a research session with them, right? So those are like sort of things to keep in mind whenever you're sort of like defining your personas as well. So let's jump into the world of like customer journey maps, because I think this is sort of like key. And what exactly is a customer journey map, right? So what these maps give is a shared frame of reference around what the customer experience looks like. And this is important because everyone needs to share a same framework on what they're looking at in order for you to know whether something is working or not, right? And the thing that you will capture is the things that are working, not working, which are all subjective choices, because for some person, things may be working very well, for some it may not. But at least the touch points are the same, right? You're actually capturing the same sort of framework. In this example that you see here, you're essentially looking at like the museum going experience for visitors at the Smithsonian, right? Like essentially you're saying that from the time someone starts planning the trip to the museum till the time they leave the museum, what are all the things they need in order for them to navigate through this entire process of museum going, right? And this is where I wanted to like double down on the piece that I mentioned on the Apple Store piece as well. The part of the museum is actually just in the center, right? Like if you think about it, like, sorry, this piece is actually the museum piece, right? But you realize that everything that happens before is still part of the museum experience. Everything that happens after is also part of the museum experience, although this is where they're actually like really touching your product, right? Same thing with respect to buying like an Apple phone or a Tesla car, right? The part of buying a phone happens in the store probably, but there's so much of like choices and planning that goes on beforehand for the user, where you're essentially like looking at all the feature sets, you're trying to understand like what the price points are. Do you want to see whether there is a cheaper plan that you can sign up for, getting those comparative features between product A and product B. All of that is happening behind. Then once you get the product as well, you want to like make sure that the product is working and it is set up, and then you basically get these sort of like follow-ups from like the Apples of the world asking you whether your product is working as per your experience and all those things. So these are all the things like if you think about the museum going experience, from the time you start thinking, okay, I want to go to DC and start visiting these museums, you have the tourism industry where you need to get the guidebooks to understand what museums are there. You're speaking to your friends and family, the word of mouth experience. You're seeing ads for the Smithsonian, and then you're essentially like finding out which bus to take or which train to take to the museum, find out all the signs and the maps. Then once you get to the museum, you want orientation. You want to know where to go, who do you talk to get information, all the exhibits and the people, and then you want the restroom stops and the places to meet, the mobile device experience, the sort of like the audio tours that you may have. And then once you leave, you actually want to start talking to folks that you've been there, you want to share, which is why like in most experiences these days, you will have that email that comes says, why don't you share with hashtag so that people know about this in the future. All of that is part of the shared experience that you want to look at. So the thing about customer journey maps is it's it is sort of like there are three steps to this, which is you want to identify what exactly are you trying to improve, like what is the opportunity to drive ideation innovation, like take your entire product experience and say, hey, I want to, let's say, improve the sign-in experience, or let's say I want to improve the payment experience, or I want to improve like the search experience. I can say I want to pick on these one area and essentially create a journey map towards that, right? What it also allows you to do is it allows you to bring multiple teams in the same space. So the organization evolution comes for everyone, whether it's the engineering team, whether it's the design team, whether it's the product team, whether it's the legal team, whether it's the marketing team, all of these teams, it allows them to think about a customer-centered approach. And in a lot of scenarios, the PM is the one who's interacting with all these teams. So having a shared framework actually helps, especially if you think about this experience as well, right? There are so many teams involved in this. There's obviously a museum team here. There is the transportation team here. So being able to bring everyone towards the same level of thinking is important, and then you can then measure and share the insights as well. So that's one of the reasons why you want to have it. Now, when you think about customer journey maps, there's front stage and backstage. And the difference between front stage and backstage is what the user sees when it comes to these experiences, whereas the backstage is everything that needs to happen, whether it's warehouse management, inventory management, whether it's having the right support staff, whether it's all of that is backstage. And these are things that you will probably never see, like the whole experience on Amazon, right, where you just click on a button and in a day or two you get the box in your house, right? there's so much going on behind the scenes in this scenario that you never get to see, but it's still part of the customer experience and it's part of the customer journey, right? And that is something to keep in mind, that there's all of these things. Now, the other thing to sort of like take into consideration is, are you creating this customer journey map for the current scenario where you operate, or are you saying that I want to be in a target scenario in the future and I want to create a journey map for that, right? So the time element is important here. Like, are you doing it for a current state or a future state? The second piece is like, who are you creating this customer journey map for? Are you creating it for the customer, the employee, or the stakeholder? Like, who exactly is the actor here? What time frame are you looking at? Is it like a day's worth of a journey? Is it a month's worth of a journey? Is it a year's worth of a journey? What's the depth for this? Like, is it just talking to the agent? Are you talking to the agent who talks to the backstage staff talking to the employees in the warehouse? So what level of depth are you looking at? Same thing with touch points, and what channel are you looking at, right? Is it the website? Is it the in-store experience? Is it the app experience? Being able to know what channel are you focusing on. So once you have all of these ironed out, you can then sort of create your customer journey map. So let's take an example of a few things here. So this is an example of hiring a cycle or renting a cycle in London. And essentially, this is how you would do it, right? You're essentially taking all of the steps, or these are all the life cycle stages or the steps that the user goes through. And you're essentially trying to talk about what are all of the external factors that need to come through in order to make all of the steps happen. You're then sort of dividing that extensive into a front stage level of sort of like experience versus a backstage versus of an experience. And then you are essentially charting out the steps that need to happen in all of this. And again, there is no judgment taken on this immediately, right? This is just capturing the information. The ideation of what you would want to build on top of this comes after this step. So the customer journey map itself is not, it's just like highlighting what your current state is. It's really not doing anything more than that. The thing that you would want to see is there are things in red. We have color coded this to some degree as well, where the things in red are things that the user has a problem with. The things in sort of like blue are things that works well enough. And the thing in one is essentially it's sort of like an agnostic stage, right? So there's really no clear opinion. So it's clearly that there is this obstacle en route, finding the docking station, running to the station. These are steps that they want some improvement in. So it allows you to then take a step back to see, okay, what would I do in these steps to actually improve, let's say, the docking station, being able to find the docking station. Maybe it's a question of having more docking stations or being able to point the user to the right docking station. So those are things that you can do to improve this. The thing about running to the station, maybe there is a way you can give the user some indication when they're riding the bike that they may be late to catch their train. So those sort of like indications are things that you can work on to sort of improve this experience. So this is one experience of what a customer journey map would look like. So I'm going to at least do one more. There's at least 3 or 4 more in this, but I don't think we have time to go through all of that because I want to touch on usability testing as well before we sort of like open it up to questions. So let's look at this customer journey map, right? The goal here is for Susan to be able to manage her money better. She wants a wealth management software or service or a product or an experience. And so she is essentially trying to figure out, how do I sign up for a wealth management system? And if you think about what her steps are, she wants to do research about what are the different accounts and services. She wants to evaluate and compare. She wants to then pick one, commit to that. She then wants to then use that to see whether her portfolio increases in size. She wants to refine and review. So she's identified the 5 steps that she wants to take. She knows what the goals in each of these steps are. Then she sort of talks about what are the different activities and touch points that go on in each of these steps, right? So you essentially line up all of those, and the sort of like the indications here also is whether it's happening over a mobile device, whether it's happening in person. So you have like those indications. How is Susan feeling through all of these steps, right? Is she feeling overwhelmed in a certain step, whether something is actually very easy? Because this sort of allows you as PMs to then pick one and say, okay, if she's being overwhelmed in the research phase, maybe there's something that you can do in this space to actually provide them with like more intuitive features. There's also a graph to show whether what their experience looks like, and also like eventually what is the opportunity as PMs or as a business to improve these stages. So this is essentially like one example of a customer journey map. I would highly recommend doing this for any project or any product that you are working on or use, because it sort of like then gives you a way to sort of think about what that next stage would look like in the solution space. The other thing to sort of keep in mind is, while these are great, a lot of times there are research consulting groups that are the ones who sort of put together a lot of these really like fancy looking charts. And it's actually one of their project deliverables to deliver on these. So a lot of times internal teams may not go to this level of sort of like sophistication in building out these things. They still have a view of this, but it's really not like this level of detail for internal teams to sort of. This is something, if you're working with a consulting agency, they will sort of interview all of your customers and then come back with these recommendations that then you work on. That is one of these experiences to sort of look at. There's a few more here. I don't want to spend too much time, but the thing to sort of like then look at is what are the different, like, okay, imagine a scenario where you've done your persona research, you've done your customer journey maps, but then you want to know, okay, how do I, like, once you've come up with, let's say, 2 versions of a sign up page or a version of a payment page, how do you know like whether any of these prototypes are actually like working, right? And what sort of usability testing options you want? So in that scenario, there's like 4 different types of tests. There's a preference testing where you are essentially asking users which of these designs do they actually prefer and which one do they like. One way to do it is first click test, which is you're essentially just putting a user in a room, giving them a prototype and asking them to achieve the goal with that prototype, right? And then just seeing how easy is it for them to actually get to it, right? Whether they can complete the task or whether it just confuses them that they don't really know what to do next. That's first click testing. Usability testing is where you are showing design to a group of users and they're asked to complete the task with a prototype, and then you have a usability testing scorecard where you're essentially seeing like what worked, what didn't work. You're trying to find out what that opportunity is. And then the final stage is a final type of testing is A/B testing. I mean, this is the one that I think we're most familiar with, which is once you have a product in market, you still want to know if you can make improvements in the user's usability on the project. And essentially, you have like 2 variants that you then randomly assign users to any of those variants, and then see which one performs better with a level of statistical analysis, right? So you're essentially, the user doesn't know which option they've been chosen. They don't know which one they're getting, but whether they're able to achieve the intended outcome is the thing that you're trying to measure over here. So these are the sort of tests that are available, and there's pros and cons in each of these scenarios. And the thing that I would, if I had to take a step back and say like which one would I recommend, the way I would look at it is if you have a product in market already, and I would just focus on A/B testing at that point, because any incremental changes that you do, you can quickly roll it out with A/B testing and see whether it won't work. But imagine you are completely redesigning your website, right? And I know, let's say an example, Facebook just recently like updated their entire front page, right, or their entire website. That's not done by A/B testing. That is something they had to go through all of these steps where they're either doing preference testing, where the very first mocks and first prototypes that they've done, they actually run it through a bunch of users to ask whether they perform like one versus the other. They're also doing like first click and usability tests. Only once they've received like the right version and the ones which meet the persona's needs, do they actually push it out live. But once you're out live, you still are testing incremental changes here and there, where you're making button sizes. Now, this is one example that I mentioned was on Facebook. Like the other one is like sites or companies that are extremely conservative about rolling anything out in market. An example of that is Amazon. Like I think the first time in like 18 or 20 years that they change the color of the buy button on their website. It's taken them all of these years to actually like run a test to see whether they can improve performance, and they've actually gone live with it. So again, all of this is dependent on how conservative your company is with respect to making these changes. But if you had to make a choice, these are the steps available to you to actually make those choices. So so we can go through this, but I know we're at 8 minutes, so I'll pause here. There's a bunch of like questions that I wanted. The other last piece I wanted to just touch on before we conclude is there's processes at the end of the day that help solve for these use cases or these sort of like customer journeys and prototype creation and usability, which is essentially like how exactly are you going to deliver building the prototype, right? Or building the product, which is you have like the waterfall project management sort of like tasks, you have agile, you have lean, you have design sprints, and it depends on the nature of the product. Like imagine you are completely redoing like an enterprise software, waterfall project management is what you may be focusing on. You'd still go through the steps of like creating customer journey maps and usability and all of those, but your waterfall project management is how you would deliver on the product. If you're sort of like constantly tweaking features and you're continuously iterating, then agile or semi-agile processes would actually work, where you're sort of launching and testing concurrently, and you're essentially like making improvements on a regular basis. Then there is the whole concept of lean is not like a design or it's not like a development process, but it's essentially a business methodology, right? Like how would you sort of like do the customer journey maps? How would you essentially talk about user research? The methodology used is you're essentially trying to get to what the user values or the customer values through improvement and respect for people. So again, it's more abstract in nature. And then there's design sprints, right? Like these are things that if you needed to get answers to specific questions, if the whole team is aligned towards sitting together for 5 days to actually go through specific steps to answer the question, these are quick ways for you to sort of like get to the bottom of like any of these questions that may be doing, whether it's about like creating the prototypes or the customer journey maps. Those are things that you can actually do in 5 days processes to actually get to the bottom of. So with this, let me pause because I think I want to leave like 5 minutes for questions, but also for conclusions at this point.
I actually have a question. So you talked about prioritizing between user personas, right? And both in Uber and Airbnb. In my mind, we have two user personas. The one would be the service provider and one would be the service receiver. Like for the example in Airbnb, the provider would be the host and the receiver is like, the people that come to stay at these apartments, right? So how do you prioritize in that case? Because if you prioritize for users, you may miss out, or not always, but you may miss out elements that help the host make it a better experience, in terms of expressing their homes. And even Uber for that matter, right? If the drivers are not able to select the rides, they may miss out on that earning. So how do you prioritize in that case?
So first of all, like as I mentioned, like personas are within your target segment, right? So I will not mix like drivers and riders personas. Those are like completely different worlds. Within your rider persona, there's multiple personas that you would look at. An example of a rider persona would look like the commuter, right? Like folks who are essentially taking rides for commutes. That's one versus the weekend sort of like party goer. That's a persona that you would look at. Whereas on the driver side of things, it could be even more complicated, right? Like drivers who are driving full time for Uber versus drivers who are part time for Uber. There's essentially like those personas, drivers that are coming out of like your city to actually come and drive in your city versus local residents who are driving. So the thing is, when it comes to marketplace type products, essentially like Uber, Airbnb stuff, it's a very different process of there's obviously other dynamics going on, which is in most marketplace products, you have to first build supply because you're assuming that demand is already there, right? Like in the case of Uber, you need drivers and your short ETAs for folks to actually even subscribe to using Uber as a product, right? So we had to focus on drivers and getting the supply up in our system. So that priority was higher. And supply hours is always one of those metrics that we track very closely because we actually need to make sure that you have enough drivers in the system and the platform at any given point of time, which means that I would focus on drivers. But within drivers also, you have to focus on the different personas, right? You need to know the distribution of how many users fall in different groups. Similarly with like Airbnb, you need enough hosts. So the supply side always takes precedence in these scenarios. So you need enough hosts on the product, and then you can bring in like the guests and also prioritize within the guest personas there as well.
Awesome. Thank you. That answers my question. There's also another question in the chat that's asking if you will be sharing this deck.
Let me see if I can share the deck, but I know this is being recorded, right?
Yes,
so
yes.
I'm sure you have like the content here, but let me see if I can share the deck. Yeah.
Okay, sure. And also, like Vivian, to answer your question, this recording link will be provided to you in the same email that you've got the invite for the meeting. Any other questions for all our attendees on the call? Okay. Thank you, Shiva, for making time and helping out with us understanding this topic. Is super important before getting started with any implementation. Of course, the product managers definitely need to have this part of the whole process, clearly defined, and they need to have a focus on this. So this is definitely helpful. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get the usual number of participants, especially this being exam week. So hopefully we have a lot of people requesting for the recordings. And I just want to ask, is it okay if our participants or students reached out to you over social media, if you are okay with that? And would you like to share some contact details?
Sure. You can find me on LinkedIn. And happy to chat further. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, folks.
Thank you so much. Have a good night.
Yep.